We all know Jordan Peterson, the Canadian clinical psychologist, the rockstar academic, the free speech warrior, the Kermit the Frog impersonator. Some people think he's gonna save the West, and other people think he symbolizes its shortcomings. He has strongly convicted opinions and doesn't shy away from controversy. But when it comes to his religious views, he is notoriously vague and evasive. So, Dr. Peterson, do you believe in God?
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God.
Okay. Do you believe in the divinity of Christ?
What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ?
Do you think Christianity is true?
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
Seriously though, instead of his religious views, I wanted to have a look at his views on atheism and explain to you why he's wrong. So we're gonna start this one off with a clip from way back around 2010 on a show called The Agenda with Steve Paikin. There was a discussion about a recent atheist bus campaign. As a guest on the show, Dr. Peterson was ready to argue.
Well, what are we talking about here tonight? We are talking about something that Toronto's transit system has decided to start, a new ad campaign for atheism. Shall we show this? Here it comes. There's probably no God, so says the ad. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. That's what the ads say, the so-called atheist bus. So let's go around the horn and get some opinions on this. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Jordan, your thoughts?
I think it's a juvenile publicity stunt pulled off by people who really neither know about nor care about the actual issues.
Get off the fence and tell me what you really think. Really, no redeeming features whatsoever? You've heard Justin say it's actually kind of provoked a bit of discussion.
Well, I don't really regard atheists as an oppressed group personally. I don't think there's any real historical evidence for that, especially in North America and Europe, and at least recently. And I think the debate is going fine without this sort of stunt, and I think it's basically a media manipulation ploy. You've seen Dawkins, you've seen Hitchens, you've seen all these guys that write these books on atheism get massive amounts of media play. So it's not like they're excluded. If anything, they're dominant. So I don't
Starting
buy
about
that
3
for a
years
bit.
ago, that's correct.
What's that?
Richard Dawkins' book came out about 3 to 4 years ago.
Yeah, so I'd like, and it's got a perfectly fine, perfectly fine reception. I mean, and there's no evidence that he's being oppressed, even though maybe he should be.
This is a grumpier and edgier Jordan Peterson than the one we're used to. But really, no evidence of historical oppression, eh? I'll limit my argument to discrimination in the US, otherwise debunking this claim would be too easy. According to Gallup, in 1959, not too long ago, only 18% of Americans were willing to vote for a qualified candidate for president if they happened to be atheist. That's recent history for ya. The number has steadily grown and now sits at 60%. But that still leaves 40% of Americans who wouldn't even consider voting for a well-qualified candidate for president if they happen to be non-religious. More people would vote for a candidate who's black, Latino, gay, a woman, and even Muslim before they will vote for an atheist. You know something is wrong if Americans trust you less than they do Muslims. The only group lower than atheists here are socialists, and for all we know, Americans don't even know the difference. Here's a quote from George H.W. Bush. A journalist asks him, "Surely you recognize the equal citizenship and patriotism of Americans who are atheists?" He replies, "No, I don't know that atheists should be considered as citizens, nor should they be considered patriots. This is one nation under God." Or take this quote by former Governor of Alabama Robert Bentley. So anybody here today who has not accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior, I'm telling you, you're not my brother, and you're not my sister, and I want to be your brother. This was in 2011, by the way, not 1959. It's not surprising that several states still have laws on the books that explicitly bar atheists from holding office. Here's what Article 19, Section 1 of the Arkansas State Constitution says. No person who denies the being of a god shall hold any office in the civil department of this state, nor be competent to testify as a witness in any court. Oh, and atheists are also barred from joining the Boy Scouts.
Boy Scouts.
You would think that someone who is as dedicated to protecting free speech as Dr. Peterson is, he might consider speaking out for any group of people not being eligible for office, only for expressing their opinion. Finding this only took me like 5 minutes, so make of that what you want. And some stigmas around atheism still exist today, like the one that non-believers are prone to criminality, immorality, nihilism, and most of all, communism. This brings me to Peter Hitchens. Now, Peter here used to be a godless communist, a Trotskyist to be exact, but has since grown up and is now your typical Christian conservative. I think he is against gay marriage.
Marriage as an institution in general in this country is rapidly diminishing, and more people are not married for many, many reasons, mainly the result of government actions which have weakened it. Now here we are arguing about this. What is actually going on here is not a liberation of homosexuals. It's an attempt to impose on the whole of society a new bigotry under which those who happen to hold the opinion that homosexual marriage should not take place will not just be excluded from the center of things, they will increasingly be hounded and treated as pariahs, just in fact as homosexuals were treated before the 1967 law was rightly repealed.
Right. I also think he doesn't believe in addiction.
Your point is to stop drugs and alcoholism by just people never starting?
Well, you too believe in this fantasy of addiction in which people lose...
Fantasy of addiction.
A complete fantasy in which people lose all power over themselves and become victims of this terrible, frightening disease.
But most of all, he thinks society will collapse if we don't hold on to our belief in the God of Abraham.
This is why I, after many, many years of not believing in God, came round to the view that I would choose to do so and act as if there is a God. God is the principal opposition in our society to lawless, ruthless power. To the bully, to the autocrat, to the despot, to the criminal, to the person who treats his neighbors like dirt. Fundamentally, once we have dispensed with that concept in our society, we are left with nothing. Now, the atheists don't wish to discuss this because they know exactly what I'm saying. They're very well aware of the implications of what I'm saying for society in general. They know perfectly well that if everybody didn't believe in God, the comfortable lives they live in extremely agreeable suburbs, where they can trust people not to cheat them and rob them and mug them and rape them, would come to an end. They want to keep the secret to themselves. They want to have all the joys, not just now, all the joys and all the advantages provided by Christianity, but not pay the dues.
Sure, atheists are moral freeloaders, and without God, people will start mugging, robbing, cheating and raping each other and screwing in the streets. His opinion of atheists, therefore, is not very high. Criminality, nihilism and immorality, those stigmas associated with atheism, are what Peter calls practical atheism. In The Mail on Sunday he writes, "Practical atheism, as I term it, is common in those blasted regions of our cities where nobody is married. There are no fathers, the remaining shops have steel shutters, the schools are places of dread for anyone who values learning or order. The police only visit to flash their lights for a few minutes before departing. The ground floor windows have bars, and the vandalized phone boxes are smeared with spittle and littered with used needles." He also made this point in the debate with his brother, Christopher.
The question of morality is utterly irrelevant
to you if you genuinely believe that which you say you believe. If you think that there is no authority, if you think that we are the products of random chaos, if there is no reason for the existence of the universe apart from a series of accidents, then you may behave exactly as you wish. Now, in the case of Christopher and his ally and colleague, Professor Dawkins, I refer to this as luxury atheism. I know where they live. They live in very pleasant parts of very pleasant cities, and they are able to advance the theory of atheism purely as a theory. Well, I live in England, and I don't need to travel very far from my home, which is not far from Professor Dawkins' home, in Oxford, to find a large number of highly practical atheists. In my country, it is common, no more than 3 or 4 times a week, to read accounts of people being kicked to death by youths aged between about 13 and 17. It invariably ends with the phrase, "and then they started kicking his head as if it were a football." These accounts grow more and more common. If you venture into the areas where these people live, you will find a complete absence of any kind of moral feeling whatsoever, a complete absence of self-government among the strong, among the healthy, among those who are able to control and take advantage of their neighbors. Christianity and everything that went with it have vanished from among them. They are practical atheists, and they really mean it.
So, according to Peter here, atheism equals kicking someone to death on the streets, anarchy, ignorance, used needles in vandalized phone booths, fatherless households, and ground floor windows with bars. That's what I call the quintessential conservative Christian position on atheism. Some might even call it extreme. And it's exactly the same position that Jordan Peterson holds. So with this rather narrow-minded or even dogmatic idea of practical atheism in mind, let's go back to the time that Dr. Peterson got all triggered about a couple of atheists exercising their free speech.
You know, there was a little bit of discussion a couple of minutes ago about shaking people's worldviews. You know, and it's not something to be done lightly. So if you, I mean, I'm very interested in what happens to people when their belief systems collapse, and not only what happens to people individually, but also socially. And so what I've learned about that that's most profound, I think, probably came from turn-of-the-century thinkers like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, who were very much concerned about the demolition of belief structures. And Nietzsche, the philosopher, is a real interesting case in point because he's the originator of the famous phrase, "God is dead." But that isn't the phrase. That's just the phrase that people like to remember. The phrase is, "God is dead, and we have killed him, and there won't be enough water to wash away the rivers of blood." And the rest of that phrase is a prophecy for the 20th century that he wrote 25 years before the 20th century began, stating quite clearly that he believed that hundreds of millions of people would be killed in the 20th century because of the decline of standard religious beliefs. That people would turn, in particular, and he prophesied this as well, in particular they would turn to communism. So, you know, none of this is a game.
Yes, the old everything that happened in the 20th century was all because of atheism argument. This argument is probably the most common one found against atheism in this kind of debate. And one of those stigmas I mentioned earlier. You don't get more immoral than Hitler or Stalin, right? Anyway, Dr. Peterson seems to equate the two. Atheism, or a decline in religious belief, automatically equals dictatorships, 2 world wars and hundreds of millions of deaths. Because the only factor at play in the 20th century is a decline in religious belief, right?
No, he was killing people because as a rational man, his conclusion that life was so unbearable it should be wiped out. You know, you guys who are in, hang on a second. You guys who are into, you know, rational thinking, forget all the time that rational thinking can go in a variety of directions. It depends on your initial presuppositions. If you believe that life is worth living, which, by the way, under some conditions is highly debatable, you're going to come up with a pretty optimistic conclusion. But if you've looked at life and you think that the suffering of most people is unbearable and that life is evil, which is what Stellan thought, you have no problems whatsoever mobilizing everything you can to kill as many people as you can. And if you don't have any faith in an ultimate authority that says essentially that life is sacred, what's to stop you from doing that?
But
The fact that you have
if
good
belief-
impulses.
It's called morality.
Yeah, where does that come from?
Well, Stalin and I differed in terms of morality. I would
Why?
actually, why?
Yeah, why?
You're being very rude, Jordan. You're being very rude indeed. My morality.
There you go. No morality without belief. If you're an atheist, like Stalin was, why not kill as many people as you can? You share the same ideology, right? The only reason one would ever want to not commit genocide is because we're afraid to be judged by some ultimate moral authority. Not because of innate morality, empathy, or compassion, or any of those things. If you don't believe in this moral authority, why not murder, rape, pillage and loot? But this clip is from a decade ago, and a lot can happen in 10 years, so maybe he has reconsidered his position.
See, I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise. But he knew that in the interval, it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies
Well,
in Scandinavia,
we were
for
pretty
example.
bad in the 20th century.
And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers. So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
one of
it's
the things
absolutely true because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular.
No,
humanists.
Then,
I know
with all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is. You should read the Secular Humanist Manifestos, because what happened in Russia and communist countries was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism. None of it.
So, where to even begin with this? First off, notice that Dr. Peterson mentions nihilism, immorality and communism as a direct or even unavoidable consequence of atheism. In fact, that's all he ever mentions while talking about atheism. Also, he has a pretty one-track mind. Whenever somebody says anything positive about atheism, he will respond with, well, what about the 20th century? So let's talk about the 20th century. It's important here to make a distinction between a multivariate analysis and a univariate analysis. A univariate analysis aims to explain a phenomenon using just one variable. Atheism equals 20th century is a univariate analysis. What you want in writing and explaining history is a multivariate analysis, because there are many factors in making the 20th century the bloodiest one in human history. One of the most celebrated and distinguished historians of 20th century Germany is Ian Kershaw. He has written a lot, and most of it about World War II, and one of his most recent publications is called To Hell and Back, Europe from 1914 to 1949. In it, he identifies 4 causes. The New York Times writes, "Why did Europe go mad? The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse Kershaw identifies in his Nightmare History are a dramatic rise of ethnic racist nationalism, angry conflicting demands for territorial revisionism, acute class conflict that took on sharper focus by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and a prolonged crisis of capitalism that many thought terminal. So you had geopolitical tensions, international antagonisms, ambitions of territorial expansion, crumbling colonialism and empire, major economic crises followed by social turmoil and political instability, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, major advancements in science, technology, infrastructure, communication and weaponry, and of course centuries-old anti-Semitism. Hundreds of books, thousands upon thousands of pages have been written to try and explain the horrors of the 20th century. But if it was up to Dr. Peterson, those pages would just say, atheism. What's even the point of researching this question? We already have the answer. Another influential book in this field is Ordinary Men by historian Christopher Brown. Ordinary Men is an account on how a unit of average middle-aged German men turned into cold-blooded mass murderers. They weren't hardcore Nazis necessarily, but a mixture of group dynamics and conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation and altering moral norms to justify atrocities made them do the most horrible things you can imagine. Some men of this unit became vicious killers. Most carried out their duties reliably, following orders, and some of them refused the killing but never questioned authority. It's interesting to see how much group dynamics and peer pressure can change a person. The accounts of Kershaw and Brown are multivariate. They look at multiple factors that might explain Nazi Germany, or, in the case of Brown, why average middle-aged men turn into cold-blooded killers. Blaming atheism for the horror that was the 20th century, as Dr. Peterson repeatedly does, sounds awfully like a univariate analysis, and you know what they say about univariate analysis.
Like if you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis.
Moving on, while Dr. Peterson loves to talk about the implications of atheism in the 20th century, he fails to mention the religious factor. There were many religious implications in Nazism and fascism. There's too much ground to cover here, but I'll just give you some bullet points that show the complicity of Christianity in the final solution. The Catholic Church, while officially neutral, didn't mind making pacts with fascist parties. The first pact Benito Mussolini signed when in power was the Lateran Treaty of 1929 with the Vatican, securing his grip on Italy. The Holy See also either endorsed or failed to condemn fascist regimes in Portugal, Spain, Austria and Croatia. The fascist leader of the First Slovak Republic, a client state of Nazi Germany, was actually a man in holy orders, Father Tiso. He was never excommunicated. Hitler himself also signed a pact with the Vatican, the Reichskonkordat of 1933, which was also the first pact he signed, securing yet another step towards unchallenged rule. As of today, this pact is still in power. The role of the wartime Pope, Pius XII, was also highly controversial. He remained silent about the slaughter of Europe's Jews, even after the war had ended. So the usual claim that he remained silent during the war to prevent worse doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Then again, it took the church until 1962, almost 20 years after the war, to repudiate the official belief that all Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Christ. 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism might just have had something to do with the reservoir of anti-Jewish hatred readily available in Nazi Germany. Of course, the belt buckles of German soldiers famously said, "Gott mit uns," or "God is with us," and Hitler invoked God to mobilize his troops.
First, fascism, the original 20th century totalitarian movement, is really, historically, another name for the political activity of the Catholic right wing. There is no other name for it. Francoism, Salazarism, what happened in Croatia, in Austria, in Bavaria, and so on. The Church keeps on trying to apologize for it, can't apologize for it enough. It's the Catholic right, Mussolini. You can't quite say that about Hitler, National Socialism, because that's also based on Nordic and pagan blood myths, leader worship and so on, though Hitler never repudiated his membership of the Church. And prayers were said for him on his birthday every year till the very end, on the orders of the Vatican. And all of these facts are well known, and the Church still hasn't found another way to apologize for that enough. And whatever it is, you can call that, you can't call it secular. You may not call it secular. By the way, Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. 50%, according to Paul Johnson, the Catholic historian, of the Waffen-SS were confessing Catholics. None of them was ever threatened with excommunication, even threatened with it for taking part in the final solution. But Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated for marrying a Protestant. You see, we do have our standards.
Even Stalin's regime in godless Russia wasn't without its own religious implications.
You're Joseph Stalin. It's 1917 in Russia. Millions of Russians have been told for hundreds of years that the head of the Russian government is something more than a human being. Not a god. It's not as bad as Japan. And not quite a pope either, but he's the Tsar is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He stands between heaven and earth. A bit more like the Middle Kingdom. Servility and credulity is en masse inculcated right across the country. Millions of people know no better. If you're Joseph Stalin, who, by the way, this is an opportunist point of mine, but I have to mention it, was a long-time seminary student, had rehearsed to be a priest. You shouldn't be...
Was he not expelled?
I think he may have just cleared out, but
I think he
one
was
way
expelled,
or another.
yeah.
But you shouldn't be, if you're Joseph Stalin, you shouldn't be in the dictatorship business if you can't exploit a great pool of credulity and servility like that. There you have it. It's waiting. All you need to do is say I'm the new Tsar. And what happens? A new inquisition, a heresy hunt, show trials. The traitors are among us. The heretics are here, trying to poison the wells. Miracles. Lysenko, our great new biologist, has shown how we can grow 25-foot wide tomatoes that will feed an entire family. Stakhanovite saints. The entire thing is completely replicated and collapses as the Inquisition did. Now,
so Stalin is murderous because he's an imperfect
well, it's
atheist?
a replication. It's a surrogate for the same thing. It's a replication of a counterfeit, or if you like, a true bill copy of the same thing.
Thus, Christopher Hitchens writes, those who invoke secular tyranny in contrast to religion are hoping that we will forget two things: the connection between the Christian churches and fascism, and the capitulation of the churches to National Socialism. On to the next point. The freest, happiest, most tolerant, prosperous and altogether livable countries in the world are those with a secular democracy and high numbers of the religiously unaffiliated. Think of the Scandinavian countries, Benelux countries, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, Germany. Other non-Western countries that oftentimes rank high on such lists, like Japan, Hong Kong and Singapore, are largely non-Christian and follow non-theistic religions. The most religious countries in the world, on the other hand, are the most repressive, unfree and depressing parts of the world, with high numbers of professed religious belief. Just look at Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Religion is hardly the only obstacle that these countries face, but it can also hardly be said that a high number of professed belief brings you a more open and just society. So, in conclusion, no, a decline in religious belief does not mean immorality, nihilism, lawlessness and communism. Oftentimes the opposite, actually. But Dr. Peterson is a clinical psychologist, and as a clinical psychologist he is interested in the individual, not the group. So what does he have to say about what a decline in religious belief does to an individual?
My question is for you, Dr. Peterson.
You alluded to an important distinction between someone who would actually be an atheist and someone who merely professes to be an atheist. You implied that Matt and others are not genuinely atheists. I'm curious why you think that. Is it just because we have sacred values, that everyone has sacred values? What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And I can't really come up with a better answer than that, because it's such a complicated question that that's the right answer.
Who's Raskolnikov, you ask? Well, let's ask Dr. Peterson.
In Dostoevsky's book Crime and Punishment, he has his main character, Raskolnikov, decides that he's going to commit a murder, and he has very good justification for the murder. And Dostoevsky's very good at this. He puts his characters into very, very difficult moral situations and gives them full justification for pursuing the pathway that they're pursuing. And so Raskolnikov, he's broke and starving. He wants to go to law school. His sister's about to prostitute herself, roughly speaking, by marrying a guy that hates her, that she hates, and he has contempt for her, at least acts in that manner. He's trying to rescue his mother as well, who's also in dire financial straits. He goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his meager possession so that he can continue to scrape by. And she has this niece, I believe it's her niece, that's not very bright, who she basically treats as a slave and is horrible to. And so the pawnbroker has this money. Raskolnikov is in dire need. He thinks, look, I'll just kill her, because why the hell not? I'll take her money. She's not doing any good with it anyways. I'll free her niece, who's just lurking as a slave. She's got all these other people tangled up in her pawnbroker schemes. All that'll happen is the world will be a better place. And the only thing that's holding me back is conventional moral cowardice. And, Dostoevsky has his character in Crime and Punishment go through days, hours and days and weeks of intense imagination about this, rationalization about this, trying to justify himself, placing himself outside the law so that he can perpetrate this act, and telling himself with all the best nihilistic arguments that the only possible thing that could be holding him back is an arbitrary sense of indoctrinated morality.
So, according to Dr. Peterson here, a true and honest atheist is a cold-blooded, calculated, nihilistic murderer and materialist with no regard whatsoever for conventional morality. At least he's not hiding his true feelings.
And Raskolnikov, who's also sort of torturing himself, or sort of tortured because he's sort of hungry and not very well, not thinking very clearly, he undertakes the murder, and he gets away with it. And before he does it, he berates himself in what I would describe as the negative atheistic style. And he basically says, look, there is every rational reason to split this woman's skull with an axe. Look at all the good I would do. Look at all the well-being I would enhance. And so he does it. And then all hell breaks loose. And what Dostoevsky Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational, pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it.
How do I even respond to this? Am I to believe that without any divine moral supervision we will start murdering, raping and looting at will? Oh yeah, that's exactly what he wants us to believe. Would it be so easy as to say that we have innate morality? But where does that come from? That's a question that has kept philosophers busy for a while. But if you were to ask me, I would say the question of the origin of morality is again not a univariate one. Many factors determine our moral codes. There's probably a universal biological morality. Frans de Waal argues that some mammals, most notably monkeys and apes, show emotions like reciprocity, empathy, compassion and a sense of fairness.
She gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
History also determines our moral codes. The main reason that we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is because we want to avoid the atrocities of the 20th century. Many pre-Christian, non-theistic philosophers like Confucius, the Buddha, and Socrates pondered what it meant to be a moral person and how to build a just society, all without a mandate from God. Then there's art, literature, and culture, and the simple fact that we are social creatures. It's only natural that social beings like us would care about each other's well-being. And yes, religion also plays a role here, but it's hardly the only factor, let alone the fundamental one. I'll leave you with a clip from Christopher Hitchens, who gets asked by a rather arrogant Reverend Sharpton where we get our morals from.
A very suggestive thing that you just said. If there was no one in charge, how would we know how to act morally? And this is a very profound observation. It's said it's argued by Smerdyakov in the Brothers Karamazov. It said, without God, anything is permissible. Some people believe that. Some people believe that without the fear of divine total surveillance and supervision, everyone would do exactly as they wished, and we would all be wolves to each other. I think there's an enormous amount of evidence that that's not the case, that morality is innate in us, that solidarity is part of our self-interest in society as well as our own interest, and very much to argue the contrary, that when you see something otherwise surprising to you, such as a good person acting in a wicked manner, it's very often because they believe they're under divine orders to do so. Stephen Weinberg puts it very well. He says, left to themselves, evil people will do evil things and good people will try and do good things. If you want a good person to do a wicked thing, that takes religion.